and I feel like I'm like having a history test because there's all these dates and I had to write them all down because it gets confusing. But I'm not going to go too much into the story of Robert Harper because you're going to get a really great history of him at his grave. But we know he was born in Pennsylvania to a Quaker family. He was coming to the Winchester area to build a meeting house and came through the Hole, which was the beautiful name of our little town in the 1700s, and decided to buy the ferry that existed here and moved his family here, built a house, and in his will, I have to look at my notes, 1782, as I can't remember back that far, he asked that 4 acres be set aside for a church and for a cemetery. After his death, his heirs sold a lot of the property here to the U.S. government, and they didn't set aside the 4 acres. And so the U.S. government ended up doing that because they were really worried that the failure to enact his will could really put their title to this land in jeopardy. So that happened in 1796. In 1799, this area became known as Camp Hill. There were American forces that gathered here to prepare for a war against France. And a lot of the military individuals, some of them died and were buried here. A lot of them stayed here and went to work at the armory. And then in 1825, the U.S. government erected the stone wall around the cemetery, and that kind of became a really interesting part of the story of this cemetery. So during the Civil War, this area was heavily contested in a lot of battles, and at the close of the war, in my research at the National Archives, there's all these letters back and forth from Harpers Ferry to DC about the wall around this cemetery. And apparently, during the war, the Union soldiers took stones out of the wall and used them to make ovens in their tents and their huts. And so you had about 75 Union soldiers buried somewhere here, plus a lot that went down on the other side of the Lockwood house. But because the wall had been destroyed, they really were having a hard time telling which were citizens, which were soldiers. There were hogs and cattle all over here, and they were destroying things. And so there was this big fight back and forth between DC and the citizens of Harpers Ferry, asking the government to please rebuild the wall. And it was ordered that they do it, and then they didn't do it, and by 1869 they said, it's not our problem anymore. And so at some point after that, the fence was put up, and some of the stone wall remains, but much of it kind of disappeared over time. So we now kind of come full circle to, once again, enclosing this cemetery, and you can see that there's a lot of work going on with the fence and the arch, and so kind of brings us right back to present day, that some things never change.
Robert Harper left no writings that I know about. He held no formal office. He had no family members who wrote much about him, but still we know more about him than we typically do about people of his day. Much of that we've learned from his will and his family genealogy and this town that he founded. So I want you to go back to the 17th century and imagine what this whole region was like. We have Monacan, people of the Monacan and Manahoac nations living around Harpers Ferry, the Native Americans, tribal names that might be more familiar to you: Shawnee, Delaware, Tuscarora, and they're attracted to some of the same things that attract people today: the fishing, the water, the hunting, the wood. European settlement was just starting to come in. Small iron mining and small iron foundries on either side of the Potomac River, and a charcoal industry that was meant to feed those foundries. And so that was the first industry in the area. Farming is just very slowly beginning to come into the region. And of course, the gap down here in the Blue Ridge was becoming an important transportation link between the cities to the east and the frontier to the west. A guy named Peter Stevens had squatted in the area around 1730. He built a log cabin, and he started a little operating ferry. When I say squatted, because the official title to the land belonged to Lord Fairfax, who had the royal land grant from the King of England. So in 1747, Robert Harper comes through the gap, and he is, like Thomas Jefferson later would be, wowed away by the beauty. But he's also a very practical oriented business guy, and he becomes instantly attracted to the potential for transportation, real estate development, and water power. Robert Harper was a builder, we might even say an architect, and he was a millwright from Philadelphia. He was actually on his way further south and west. He was going to build a Quaker meeting house in Orange County, Virginia. We know a bit about his family background. His grandparents were Quakers. They actually were so early into Pennsylvania that they were on the banks of the Delaware to meet William Penn when he got off the boat. However, we do also know that at some point, some of his Robert Harper's branch of the family converted. Robert Harper was baptized into the Church of England. Robert Harper, because of his interest in this area, ended up purchasing acreage from Lord Fairfax. He also purchased Peter Stevens' log cabin and his ferry service, and he started building mills on what we call Virginia's Island in the Shenandoah, a sawmill and a grist mill. He founded this town that was first known as Shenandoah Falls at Robert Harper's Ferry. He lived originally down right on the banks of the river, but sometime around 1780, he decided, probably for obvious reasons, he needed to move up to drier ground and safer ground. So you can see his last remaining home that he built as part of the park just down the hill from me. The Robert Harper house is right across from St. Peter's Church today. However, he did die before he moved into the house, so it was used later as a tavern and as a residence for his heirs. Robert Harper was married, but he had no children. When he died, he left all of his wealth and property to nieces and nephews. One of the nieces, who had married into the Wager family in Philadelphia, had inherited all of the town acreage. Hence, that's all the Wager family name that you see on most of the graves in this little complex. A nephew, whose name was Harper, inherited the mills on Virginia's Island. He later sells those off to other millwrights. And of course, as Bonnie told us, this cemetery and resting place was part of his will. After Robert Harper died in 1782, just 1 year later, Thomas Jefferson arrived, just a few yards down the hill from us. He stood on that famous rock and made his observation about the passage of the Potomac through the Blue Ridge. 3 years later, George Washington arrives and has this vision for a Shenandoah Canal to skirt the rapids on the Shenandoah and similar places on the Potomac, and also has this vision to build a federal armory and arsenal to store and to manufacture guns for the new nation. But it's important to understand that the boundaries of the armory, which include most of the boundaries of the present town of Harpers Ferry, basically were the property that Robert Harper bought off from Lord Fairfax. So I think more than nearly any town in the nation, we have this strong link to the very, very earliest days of our town's founding. There's one more thing I have to say about Robert Harper that's important to remember and a little bit less honorable. When he came to the Gap, he brought with him a household slave, a woman named Beck. And she was with him the entire time that he lived in Harpers Ferry. We would like to know that, we would like to think that Robert Harper treated her well, but we really have no idea. What we do know is that when he died, Beck was included in his will. He left her to his heirs. And that was the beginning of slavery in Harpers Ferry, and also the beginning of the African American story that later becomes such an important part of this heritage, this town's heritage, which would include raiders with John Brown fighting for their freedom and liberation, students going up the hill here to Storr College, and eventually members of the Niagara movement and other groups coming to Harpers Ferry to work for civil rights. So that is the beginning of the town and the beginning of our tour.
Here with my folks, 1969, 1970, and this was my mom's favorite spot, and it was to go see Dixie, to see what he would do while you were eating dinner. And what Dixie had was the Hilton.
Yes, we can't hear you, Paul. You might need the megaphone now.
What Dixie had was the Hilltop Hotel, and we used to go to the buffet. And it wasn't a surprise that if you were just sitting there for an hour enjoying your meal, or it could be 10 minutes, Dixie was going to jump up on one of the dining room tables and ring a school bell and tell everybody, you gotta go, because I have a new chicken bus coming. And he used to have the tour buses back in the day. Remember when you go as a kid, you go to the museum? We used to have those buses like that come and do their buffet, and then I guess the people went to the racetrack. But I just thought it was so funny as a kid to see a grown man jump up on the table, and that's how he got the people out. But later on, I loved Harpers Ferry came here to open a business downtown, and I come to find out Dixie just didn't own the hotel. He pretty much owned a lot of the real estate here in Harpers Ferry that he purchased. He was a lawyer out of Baltimore, and I don't have any family history except that I do know that he had a daughter and a son that I believe that I never did meet, but I always heard about the kids. But like I said, he was an eccentric, but everybody kind of loved Dixie here in town. Everybody knew Dixie. Give you an idea, when you would go to the hotel and check it into the lobby, his bedroom was right there in the lobby, in the old hotel. So he was a person, people. Like I said, everybody that I knew enjoyed Dixie, and I just thought it was just so funny how, you're in your meal and him getting up there and running the school bell. And that, it's just a childhood memory that just made it nice to come here to Harpers Ferry. And then, like I said, when we came back later, 20 years later, I come to find out he owned all the gift shops and the property pretty much downtown. I wish I had more information on Dixie, but the childhood memories do stick in where, he was a prominent figure here in town. As you can tell, look, best seat in the house, right? If he did purchase the hotel, he was smart to get this. I mean, what a resting place. Yeah. If you have any questions, I try to answer them. Like I said, I wish I had more family history, but I do recall lawyer from Baltimore, and then moved up here to Harpers Ferry. I won't say to retire, but just to change careers and start his new,
Is that
what
his
an
real
empire.
Name? Is that his real name?
Takes help remembering this story. And I was too late to Harpers Ferry to ever have met him. He was gone by the time I arrived to town. But as John mentioned, he owned a lot of real estate around Harpers Ferry, a lot of houses. And when we first came to town, a lot of those houses were being sold off. One of them over on East Ridge Street, where the Flemings now live, the real estate agent told us that she had been first investigating the house and getting ready to show it with someone else in the real estate business, and they were up in the attic of the house. Did you mention that he started the wax museum?
No. Like I said, he owned pretty much. When I came, when we tried to rent a store, they said you have to see Dixie, and there was only one other. The people that owned the cinnamon bond shop, Gene James, had the two other stores, and it was my understanding he owned everything else downtown.
So he had founded the wax museum that still operates in Harpers Ferry. Anyway, they were up in the attic of that house getting ready to show it, and they looked over, and there was this table with something covered up with a sheet. And they're saying, what is this? And so they walk over, and they take the sheet, and they uncover what is Dixie Killam in wax lying in stage. And they both shrieked.
25-year member of the Oddfellow Lodge, as Bushrod was also a member of the lodge. I'm going to give you some dates and a little paper trail of his life. We have original books, but we keep them in a different location, so I didn't look up anything specific. Okay, he was born, and I got two dates, but I'm going to go with January 18th, 1813, and he passed away on February 18th, 1852, which would make him 39 years old. His wife was Adelaide, or Adeline, depending on where you read. She was born in October 7th, 1816, and passed away October 10th, 1878. Let's see, she was from Frederick, Maryland, and they got married in Frederick in December 12th, 1839. His father was Lazarus Pine. He was from England. His mother was named Mary. And now I'm going to give you the history, the paper trail. He was an odd fellow, May 18th, 1833, which the lodge started up here. Actually, it started in the Arsenal. They moved from the Arsenal down here on Church Street, Cary Hill's property. Then we moved up to Camp Hill. The same year Stewart College started, the Oddfellows started up there. We obtained the building from the U.S. government. He purchased stock of Henry Crampton in 1835, and then Charles Staley purchased Pine stock in 1836. He was a member of the MacIver clan. And if anybody works for the Park Service may know what that is, but I'm sure it's some kind of fraternal group. Huh? I would like to know. He was a member of that Whig Party, and he supported William H. Harrison as president. In 1843, he filed bankruptcy. Well, doing some other research, you come across where George Cutshall, he was one of the first people captured by John Brown. He said, "Hey, Bushrod, you owe him money, please pay him," you know. So people were trying to help him out. Like I said, he passed away at an early age. His daughter is buried here. Her name was Medora. I'm trying to find it on here. She was born January 1st, 1846, and passed away 1851. And if you look at, if you're on Find a Grave, there's a lady that did some research, and she kind of scrambled all the dates and so forth, but I did find the correct dates from Bushrod's probably great-grandson. So you may ask, what happened to his wife? She's not buried here. His father-in-law and his sons are buried right down the road here. His father-in-law worked for the armory, and the lodge held the meetings at their house during the Civil War because we couldn't meet because our lodge was in disrepair. But when she moved to Richmond, Virginia, and my understanding is she opened up a candy store with her son, Marshall, and she was very successful. But she also ran a boarding house down at Park Building 15. And a Mr. Engel, she had the boarding house, and a Mr. Engel ran the shop. And she's buried at Hollywood Cemetery. And when she lived in Richmond, she lived on 209 East Lee Street.
Spot here. Some of you may have known Jim Prentice. Some of you may have known his name. I hope that after today that you do remember him. Jim liked to call himself a child of the National Park Service. He was actually born in a national park at Perry's Victory and International Peace Monument in Put-in Bay, Ohio, where his father was the park superintendent. When he was 7, they moved to Hopewell Furnace Park, and he had his first living history demonstration as a blacksmith helper there at Hopewell Furnace. And then in 1961, his father was named the superintendent of the then Harpers Ferry National Monument, which of course became the National Historical Park. So this amazing place, at the age of 8, became Jim's home. The park was his playground. His family, which included 7 kids, lived in park housing right on Shenandoah Street. He went to school at Grandview Elementary School, and he was an altar boy just down the hill here at St. Peter's Catholic Church. And when he was a kid, he would say, "What's the big deal with John Brown? Why is everybody talking about John Brown? Who is this?" And that is what turned Jim into a lifelong student of history. In 1967, his father was reassigned in the National Capital Park, so the family moved to Northern Virginia. Jim went to high school there, went to James Madison University, and after college, he actually got into the construction business. He was a contractor. He had his own business, successful business for over 30 years. He was a master carpenter. He built, beautiful cabinetry and homes and furniture. But he always held on to his love of history, and he never stopped learning more things about Harpers Ferry. Around 2009, at the time of the John Brown Raid's 150th anniversary, Jim came here and volunteered for the park, and he spent countless hours orienting visitors to Harpers Ferry and its history and working in the visitor and information centers. And then around 2013, he studied, he took the exam and tested in front of park rangers and became our first certified park guide at Harpers Ferry. And he really helped build the program from the ground up. He helped mentor new guides, and he gave tours to thousands of people who came through Harpers Ferry. He got a card from someone who was on one of his tours in 2017, and he passed it on to me, and I wanted to pass it on to all of you, just to kind of express how he was able to captivate his audience talking about Harpers Ferry, and how Harpers Ferry really had become a part of his soul. Dear Jim, it's hard to put into words the impact you had on me and my family this past Saturday. Your passion and knowledge of Harpers Ferry is vast, and your love of the National Park Service added so much to our tour. We cannot thank you enough. We'll be talking about our day with you for years to come, for sure. When I first got to know Jimmy, I told him about my first experiences at Harpers Ferry and how I stood at the rail at St. Peter's, looked out at the water gap, was mesmerized for a bit, and turned to my friend and said, "Wouldn't this be a great place to live one day?" And Jim sort of chuckled and he said, "You had your Robert Harper moment." And as you heard Chris saying, that's what happens. People come through this place, it kind of captures a part of your soul, and then you end up here. Jim passed away this past December, and after his funeral service, we were gathered up here, and I was in shock, and I asked his sister, how did he get this spot among all the people that he spoke about for so many years, just yards away from Robert Harper? Did your family buy this in the 60s when they lived here? And she said, no, we came here the afternoon that he died, and this spot had just happened to open.
Jeez. Wow.
So I like to think that this was Harpers Ferry's way of thanking him for all that he did and for telling its story for so long. When he was ill last fall, Jim said that he was looking forward to the first day of spring, walking down to the point, one of his favorite places, the confluence of the two rivers. So if you have time today to spend in Harpers Ferry, I hope you go down to the point and just thank Jim for everything that he's done and keeping the stories of this special place alive.
Memorial Day 2016, 5 years ago. It was exactly on Memorial Day of 2016. Myself, my wife, and one other individual were doing restoration work here, working on these two tablets. There was nothing here except sticking out of the ground was a little rock like this. And I looked at that, and it was in line with these two, evenly spaced. It got my curiosity up, so I began excavating the site. 4 pieces were located. Let me start this on this side. About 6 inches below the surface. Let me start this on this side. And that's what I came across. What you will see are 4 pieces, if it gets around to you in time, which we have restored for Major Broadus. Major Broadus was born in 1755 in Culpeper County in Virginia. He passed away on October 5th, 1830, at the age of 75. The records indicate, although there is some discrepancy, he was married twice, we know that, and he fathered, give or take, 10 to 12 children. The records are just a little bit hazy on that. One of his grandsons, about 30 some years later after his passing, ends up being a member of the Confederate forces, ends up being a very famous general, but basically you probably never heard of him because he fought in the Western Theater in the Tennessee and Missouri campaigns. It was General Merriweather. So that was the family roots there. 1776, William Broadus is 21 years of age. At that time, he enlists in the Virginia State Marines, and he served on a row galley, R-O-W. A row galley at the time was a naval battleship powered by oars. While living in Culpeper County, he enlisted, like I said, at age 21. Later that year, you could just pass that back here.
Anyone else not seeing it?
Later in 1776, he transfers from the Navy, from the Marines, into land service and under Colonel Gibson's 1st Virginia State Line. And at that time, in 1776, he's listed as a sergeant. Later that year, he, probably in the beginning, I forget the date here, July 1777, he forced marched from Culpeper, Virginia, to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to join General Washington, and spent that brutal winter of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge. Now, I watched with delight all of us marching up this hill a few minutes ago. Now, can you imagine marching with full gear from Culpeper, Virginia to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania to meet General Washington to engage up in that area? May 20th, 1778, he joined General Lafayette's forces and fought at the Battle of Barren Hill in eastern Pennsylvania. He was surrounded by British troops, and he narrowly escaped capture by swimming and wading across the Schuylkill River that runs into Philadelphia. June 28th, later that year in 1778, he fought at the famed Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey, which was a brutal battle. He survived that, and then he winter camped nearby in Middlebrook, New Jersey, where he spent the winter. December 7th, 1778, he's promoted to second lieutenant, and he marched into New York, where he was handpicked and assigned to an elite light infantry corps. And this light infantry corps would be very similar to today's SEAL team or Green Beret. He returned in 1779 to the 1st Virginia State Regiment and marched into Philadelphia. Then he marched all the way down to Williamsburg, Virginia. The summer, this is interesting, the summer of 1780, he was declared a supernumerary, and he was sent home on half-pay status for the remainder of the war pending recall. And the reason he was placed in that position, because his ranks were depleted and they had no use for him as an officer at that time. 1824, William Broadus moves here to Harpers Ferry. He serves as the local justice of the peace, and he is then eventually promoted to major in the Harpers Ferry militia. He was then appointed paymaster at the Harpers Ferry Armory by President Monroe and held this position until his death in 1830. He resided at the paymaster house down off of Shenandoah Street. If you walk under the trestle where the high water marks from the floods are, and you walk under the trestle, you'll see the remains encircled by stones that the Park Service has excavated years ago. And that was home number 43, and that's where he lived. October 19th, 1824, along with other Revolutionary War veterans, he then marched down to Yorktown to join a huge ceremony honoring French General Lafayette. March 3rd, 1830, he received authorization from the U.S. government to begin drawing a lifetime pension for his war service of $320 a year. He died before he ever received a single penny. His death on March 5th, 1830, was preceded by approximately 2 weeks of a very severe illness. His funeral service was held right here where you're standing. The obituary was in the Virginia Free Press, and it indicated that there was a huge crowd that attended his funeral service, including a lot of veterans from the Revolutionary War. He was afforded complete military honors along with complete Masonic honors. Major William Broadus. Just for your information, you'll see on a couple tombstones up here, particularly this one, the angel that we'll go to soon. You'll see coins across the top. That's a sign of respect. When people visit a ceremony, they place coins. I can tell you on a summer day, on a summer weekend, this entire top is full and there'll be coins laying down there. And then we pick those up and we'll place them in a deposit where we use those funds for restoration. So that was William Broadus, quite a guy.
Chambers, but probably the most well-known are buried right here. And those are Jenny Chambers. This is her stone. And her father, Edmund Chambers, next to her. This is a monument to the family. If you are at all familiar with the Murphy Farm across 340, you know that it's now owned by the Park Service because of its significance during the Civil War. Before it was the Murphy Farm, it was the Chambers Farm. Edmund having purchased it in 1848. He lived there with his wife, Mary Miller Chambers, his daughter Jenny, and 4 other children, and he was employed at the armory. Things were pretty peaceful at the Chambers Farm until trouble started in 1859. Jenny was 15 years old, walking to school on the morning of October 17th, 1859. When she got within view of the town of Harpers Ferry, she realized something very scary was going on. Being someone who loved to write, she wrote down her experiences from that day, and years later her story was published in Harper magazine. The title of her article is What a Schoolgirl Saw of John Brown's Raid, and this is a short excerpt. I was a mile on my way to the Young Ladies Seminary in Harpers Ferry on a Monday morning that I shall never forget, when coming in sight of town, my heart stopped beating and I dropped my books. As I looked over the edge of the hill, I saw riding up and down the streets, shouting and brandishing their guns, a crowd of men. It seemed to me that they were all yelling and some of them were firing in the air. There has never been for me a day like that of October 17th, 1859, when I saw what I afterwards knew was to go down in history as the John Brown Raid. Jenny goes on to describe in great detail the events of the John Brown Raid in her 8-page article, which was actually published in January of 1902 in Harper magazine. So that was when she was 15. 3 years go by. In September of 1862, the Chambers family found itself in the middle of a war zone. Their property was critical to Stonewall Jackson's plan to capture the federal garrison at Harpers Ferry. On the night of the 14th, Jackson's men dragged their cannons into position to turn the Union's left flank, which was positioned adjacent to the farm. Confederate artillery pounded the Chambers farm while the family hid in the cellar. Jenny was 18 at the time, and this is what she wrote. One shell exploded in front of the cellar door. Another cut a limb from a large tree at the corner of the house. At about 10 a.m., the firing ceased, and we were called out to gaze upon the white flag on Bolivar Heights. The grape shot, shell, and cannonballs were lying almost like hail over the barn and fields of the farm. It was literally torn to pieces by the shelling. Following the Union surrender, Jenny saw soldiers from both sides come together on her farm. I remember my father passing around a large basket of peaches to the blue and gray indiscriminately as they sat conversing. I looked at them and said, "See what you are doing. A little while ago you were in deadly combat. Now you are friends." The answer came, when we are in war, we are in war. When the battles are over, we are brothers. Restitution was promised to Edmund Chambers for the damage to his farm, but in 1890 he died while still trying to settle his claim. There is no evidence that he was ever paid. That seems to be a recurring theme. So if you visit the Murphy Chambers farm, you'll see a sign with a lot of the farm's history, including the John Brown Fort resting there for a while. On the farm, there's a painting of Harpers Ferry that was attributed to Jenny Chambers. So not only was she a talented author, but she also painted. She has a lot of writings and assorted family letters that are housed at Duke University. They've been there since 1954. So she was an amateur artist, published author, and ardent church worker at the Camp Hill Church right here in Harpers Ferry. But she's best known for the piece that she wrote about the John Brown raid. She died in 1907 at about, I think, age 63. And that's Jenny Chambers and Edmund.
Mayor's Corner, because there are a few of Harpers Ferry's mayors buried here. But Bradley Nash was the Harpers Ferry mayor from 1971 to 1977, and then again 1981 to 1987. And he was a pretty interesting guy. Born in Boston, went to Harvard, and he ended up in the administration of Dwight Eisenhower, and also worked for Herbert Hoover. He was a banker and also a lieutenant colonel in the Army during World War II. He made significant contributions to Harpers Ferry because of his political connections. Was very, very instrumental in moving Harpers Ferry from a national historic monument to a national park. And there's a flag, I don't know if it's still there, but there was a flagpole dedication to him when Harpers Ferry became a national park. So, and this is bad, so maybe it's like girl power or something, but I love his wife way more than I love him. He had 3 wives, never had any children. He married a lady from Massachusetts, and then he married Ruth Cohen Nash, and then he married Jenny Ingram. And he was like old when he married Jenny. Ruth, his second wife, is like an amazing woman and got not a whole lot of attention compared to the mayor. But she actually also was an amazing person in her own right. She was actually the first female war correspondent during World War II. And she was attached to the Women's Army Corps, and so she was embedded with them and traveled all over reporting back through the Associated Press on the war efforts, which was unheard of for a woman. for a long time, she wrote for the United Press under her middle name, which was Baldwin. And it wasn't until someone came to the newsroom to meet Baldwin Cohen and praised him for his stories that they figured out it was her, and then they fired her because she was a woman. So she married him. She worked in DC and married Bradley, and they moved to Harpers Ferry. They bought the old Barker farm, which is now called the Nash Farm, up on Bolivar Heights. And they were just avid gardeners. They loved the wildlife. They had a bird sanctuary. And then she got a debilitating illness. And Jenny was her nurse and helped take care of her, possibly him. I wasn't there, so I don't know, but after Ruth passed away in 1993, Bradley married Jenny, and they weren't married for very long because Bradley died at the age of 96 in 1997. So Jenny died not that long ago in 2016. Her family was from Georgia, and but the Nash family did a tremendous amount for the development of Harpers Ferry and the park. So if you have an opportunity to visit the Nash farm, they donated it to the Park Service while they were still living there, so they were able to live there until they died. And then it transferred over to the Park Service, and it's a beautiful spot. You can walk the grounds and just kind of appreciate what they did both for our country and for this town.
Some people pronounce Shugart, but the family today mainly says Sugar. And his wife, Margaret, or Maggie. And Ed Wheelis is showing a picture of Eugene and Maggie. Eugene was born in 1867. Was born into a German family in the Shepherdstown area. However, they were business folk. They were not farm folk. And the family later moved to Charlestown, and I believe Eugene was born and grew up in Charlestown. His father, Reason, sometimes you see it R-E-Z-I-N, sometimes spelled like the word reason, was a saddle and harness maker. He was on the jury for two of the co-conspirators in the John Brown raid. And some of the Shugart cousins opened up a department store in Charlestown. If you go to the county museum in Charlestown, you can see some exhibits about that department store. Eugene married Margaret, or Maggie, Trussell, and the two of them moved to Harpers Ferry in 1891. They built a large frame house where the Harpers Ferry guest house is now, over on Washington Street, just opposite Appalachian Trail Conservancy. And that house burned down maybe about 35 years ago, but it's my understanding the guest house was built to kind of with some resemblance to the old house. There it was that they raised their three oldest children, Frank Eugene, Margaret, and Eliza. Although Eugene was not independently wealthy, he apparently never owned a business or worked for a private employer, but instead he was a public servant who was involved in various affairs of his adopted town. He served at different times as magistrate, constable, justice of the peace, postmaster, notary public. He was volunteer bandmaster. In fact, if you, after the tour, if you go over to the gazebo on Washington Street, you can look at a historical marker in front of the gazebo, see him as bandmaster in that photo. He was a vestryman for St. John's Episcopal Church and a prominent booster of Harpers Ferry High School. Eugene was elected mayor of Harpers Ferry in 1902, served 6 successive one-year terms. After his 1906 win, the Charlestown newspaper, Spirit of Jefferson, commented on his re-election and service. It said, "This being Mayor Shugert's 5th successive term proves his popularity with the people, and that the city government has never been in more capable hands is also shown by the published statements of the town affairs. Mr. Shugert is also the efficient deputy sheriff of Harpers Ferry District, and in such capacity has served his constituents honorably and faithfully." So besides these involvements, Eugene was also known as an ardent collector. His collections of Civil War relics was massive, and items of them are still sometimes seen at auctions and sales. His fondness for artifacts from fires and other disasters was strong enough that he wrote Mayor Temenis of Baltimore after that city's great fire in 1904, asking for a souvenir of the event. You might get the impression this guy was a little quirky, and I certainly feel that way. In 1910, Eugene purchased land from the War Department by what is now East Ridge Street. He dug a foundation and proceeded to build Laurel Lodge, a stone bungalow. It is now my home and Ed's home. We're not sure why he took on this big project, but he had 2 new children, Jarvis and Eugenia, and perhaps he wanted a place to show off his relics and curios. The stone bungalow, unlike anything else at that time in Harpers Ferry, went up mainly in 1914 and 15. His descendants believe that he paid $25 for one of the armory warehouses along the Potomac, and in ruins since the Civil War, and hauled the stones up the hill in an ox-drawn wagon. We've seen one of the photos of that, of him with that wagon. 2 German stonemasons, Stoutenberger and Heifer, did the masonry. Mr. Heifer's buried just over by the gate, not far from here. The house Laurel Lodge was especially notable as a showcase for Eugene's curios and his eccentric personality. He hung lock chains from the C&O Canal on the front porch, embedded a number of his collected artifacts into the stonework and the pillars of the house. Civil War rifles and bullets, Union Army belt buckles, twisted bottles and charred quartz found after the Hilltop House Hotel burned in 1912. He also inscribed or painted slogans in the walkways or under the sleeping porches. Said things like, "Please don't worry. Worry is interest paid on trouble before it is due. Some are profiteering and some are just hogging it. Be a booster." And my favorite, ever since Gold Dimples has learned that potatoes have eyes, she has refused to take her bath in the cellar. Maggie and Eugene and their children made Laurel Lodge an active and social part of the community, but sadly, he didn't enjoy life at the new house for very long. He died in September 1919, possibly from a heart attack. He had served 1 additional term as mayor and remained active in public affairs until the last. Laurel Lodge was in the Shugert family until the mid-60s, but the children and grandchildren have spread out. I've met descendants all the way from Georgia up to northern Pennsylvania. There's only one descendant that I know of who still lives in this area. I don't know if any of you know Stephanie McCarthy over in Cavalier Heights neighborhood. She is a great-great-granddaughter.
Okay, this little angel is probably a favorite of a lot of people that walk through here. I know it's one of my favorites. It was placed here in memory of a little girl named Montana Eleanor Gannon, who died when she was just 3 years old. Her father was a physician in Harpers Ferry, and so we can only imagine how hard it must have been for her dad, being a doctor, not being able to fix whatever was wrong with her. Don't know the cause of her death. I do know that he passed away 5 years later, and he's buried right here. And her mother, Mary Gannon, actually lived until 1935 or 35, and she was a teacher in Boise, Idaho, for many years after this happened. So she, obviously came back here to be buried. And that's all I know about that family. But the reason I wanted to talk about this angel today is not because of the family, but because of a story associated with this little monument. In about 1970, a couple from Pennsylvania was visiting the cemetery. Their names were William and Constance Hershey. Don't know if they were related to the Hershey chocolate factory, but they were married sometime in Harpers Ferry at St. Peter's Church. So they like to come back here a lot and visit. So 1970, they're walking through the cemetery, and they notice that a piece of this little angel's wing is laying on the ground. So they picked it up, fully intending to find a Park Service employee or somebody locally to give it to. And what happened was they ended up taking it home. I guess they couldn't find anybody that they could trust with it. So they took it home. They moved to a new house. The broken wing went with them in a box, and it was in their attic for about 45 years. In 2011, William passed away, and in 2016, his wife Constance was going through their belongings. She comes across the angel wing, and at that point, fortunately, we had a website. So she contacted Hardy Johnson, one of our trustees, and was able to return the wing to the angel. So our conservator, who does professional work on our stones, he's from Hanover, Pennsylvania. His name is Robert Moscow. He did the restoration, and he did a great job. You can hardly tell where it was cracked. It was right in here is where the repair is. So the top part of this wing is what was in their house for about 45 years before it was returned. So she's got a little hole here between her two hands where she can hold flowers. I think that was purposeful on the part of her parents. She needs a good cleaning. If you look around, you'll see lots and lots of the stones have biological growth growing on them. And so we have a product that we use that kills a lot of the biological growth, and she definitely needs a good cleaning, and she's going to get some attention very soon. Being under this tree is a little bit of a concern for me. She's had branches falling on this side of her. She's had branches falling on this side of her. But fortunately, she's been okay. So she's very special to our cemetery. And so that's all I have to share about her.
Ranger for 16 years, and I left last year, so I'm a little rusty in my public speaking, but hopefully I have my notes to help me remember good information about both Nathan and his sister Laura. Has anyone ever heard of Nathan Brackett before, or Laura? Yes. A few people. Nathan is most well known for being the president of Storer College at its beginnings, but I'm going to backtrack a little bit and talk about him before that. He was born in Phillips, Maine on July 28, 1836, and then Laura was born on May 6, 1850, along with her twin sister. Now, this is one of my favorite stories about Nathan that has nothing to do with his history here, was that apparently his parents asked his input on his sister's names, the twin sisters. and he was about 13 when they were born, and being a boy and a teenager, I think he must have thought this was a joke, because their names are Laura Ellen and Laura Ella. I mean, if your parents are mad at you, you're screaming for one of your kids, Laura Ella, like, but they both sound the same, right? So Laura started going by Lou, and her sister Laura started going by Nellie. And that kind of fixed that confusion. I think Nathan must have been a jokester. In 1857, he would go on to study at the State Seminary in Maine, and then he would graduate from Dartmouth in 1864. He tried to get into the Army during the Civil War, but had some medical conditions that kept him from being allowed. But the United States Christian Commission allowed him to go into service for the Army, and he ended up in the Shenandoah Valley. He was actually, my understanding is he was actually in charge of taking sometimes the pay back and forth from like a central location then out to the soldiers. Let's see. Now 64, 65. Nathan is asked by the Free Baptist Home Mission Society to become a superintendent of a mission school here in Harpers Ferry, and also kind of in charge of all of them that are into the Shenandoah Valley. And he starts to think that maybe he should start a larger school, a more permanent school here in Harpers Ferry, and that will eventually become Storr College. His first school here was in the Lockwood House, just behind me, and he had 19 students in that first class. His wife Louise joined him. They were actually married right when he was assigned here. They were married in October of 1865, and they would have 5 children, and of his children, 3 of his daughters would teach at Storr College. Nathan would be here for 30 years as a teacher, so he was the president and a teacher. So he resigned in 1897, and then after that he would hold the position of treasurer until his death on July 20th, 1910. His sister is who I really studied when I got into the Storr College history a few years ago. We were getting ready for the 150th anniversary of the school, which would have been in the 150th anniversary was in 2017. So we did a lot, including, I'll put a plug, I no longer work for the Park Service, so I can plug products, including this book that park rangers and volunteers and Park Association staff wrote about Storr College. It was great working on that. And I wrote a chapter about philanthropy and the women of Storr College and how they wanted to raise money to build more dormitories and school buildings. And so Laura, well, I'll call her Lou, Aunt Lou was very instrumental in that. So Lou showed up here in 1870 as an assistant teacher at in the normal department, which was the part of the school that was teaching folks to become teachers, to go out and teach the newly freed African Americans their ABCs and their math and just everything to be able to function in society. She had graduated 2 years earlier from the normal school in Maine, and just came along soon after to work with her brother. In 1875, so 5 years after she'd been here, she was fully funded as the lady principal, and she was funded by the Free Baptist Women's Missionary Society. So these folks out in Maine were raising money for mission schools where their folks of their flock, folks of their religion, were out teaching. So she is the very first teacher funded by them here at Harpers Ferry. She would often write in the women's newsletter, which was called the Missionary Helper, that went out again to all of the people that were of the Free Baptist or the Free Will Baptist faith. And she would write in the very first issue of the Missionary Helper soliciting money to build a girls' dormitory because there were so many students coming in, but there wasn't enough room for that. So, interestingly enough, after Nathan dies in 1910, Lou becomes the treasurer because she's always been a person that is raising money. She continues that in her later years. She was the longest, to my knowledge, she was the longest serving educator or person affiliated with Storr College. She was here for over 50 years, and she would die in the summer of 1925. She had married Scott Leitner, and what year was that? In 1884. They didn't have any children, but as I said before, Nathan and Louise would have several, and some of them are buried here. There are still descendants in Harpers Ferry community. I think their family went on to open the Cliffside Hotel, which is now the Quality Inn, I think. Clarion, I don't know, it's changed names so many times, the Clarion. So that vicinity, and then one of their daughters, I forget which one, she moved to Montgomery County, Maryland, and married a very prominent man in the U.S. Patent Office, and had been known to go to parties at the White House. And there are definitely things that she married into the Robertson family. There are definitely things named after them in Montgomery County, and there's still family descendants there because they came back for the Descendants program in 2017. So this family, there's a lot of research, a lot of interesting stories about each of the daughters, especially the women were really prominent. And Louise, let me make one last thing about Louise. She would teach sewing and art here, and the Storr College logo and anything that was artistic during her time period that appeared in Storr College literature was probably created by Louise. But definitely the Storr College logo was a product of Louise Wood Brackett. So any questions about this prominent Storr College family?
This is Harry Highshore Chambers, born in October 30th, 1872, died on March 25th, 1964, lived to the age of 91. His parents was George Washington Chambers, and there are two George Washington Chambers. One's right over here, and here's another one. And again, his paper trail, he purchased the Ives property in 1899. He was a telegraph operator from 1900 to 1929. His last operator status was B&O Railroad at Engle. He attended the convention of Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons in Charleston, and the following year he attended the Tri-State Rally held in Martinsburg. At one time in this area there was 11 Oddfellow Lodges. There were 2 here in Harpers Ferry. I just found one the other day in Charlestown at the Fisherman's Hall. That was Oddfellow Lodge. And why he is important, because in this little black book from 1942, he went through all the minute books from 1933 or 1833 till the 1950s at least. He wrote all the history of who did what, and if he didn't know where it was, he says I can't locate it. But since then, but the one thing that caught my eye is we have a lot of, if you walk by the lodge, you can see where the cannon shot had hit the wall. And I'm thinking, what happened to the cannonballs? What went on? Well, one of the brothers, Brother Rule, in 1976, he asked permission to pick up the shot and shell. They were still on the ground, 11 years later, But what's important about all the Oddfellows here, and anybody who lived here early, they worked hard, and they learned from history, and they moved on. And the Oddfellows are about doing the same thing today. you know, it's time to fix things, get things right. Our lodge, I was asking a young lady, she says, can I join the lodge? And I said, yes, you can. 2000, we started letting women in the lodge. My lodge is a member. She was a Noble Grand. She's a secretary now. We have like 6 or 7 other ladies. Anybody's welcome to join. The only things are you have to believe in the Supreme Being, have good character, and that's all we ask, you know. But from 16 to whatever age, like Bradley Nash, he was in his 90s when he joined. He and myself and 15 others joined at that time in 1995. But things are changing, the Oddfellows, for the better, and hope everybody would join. There's no pressure, but if you're local and would like to join, I have a card. Come see me. And sometimes if you want to take a tour of the lodge, we have graffiti from the basement to the 2nd floor to outside, whichever which way. And they were all members of the 5th New York Volunteers. And Abe Lincoln had stayed there. I'll tell you a short story. One of the persons that wrote graffiti on there was Asa A. Story. He's with the 5th New York. He's at the top. During the Civil War, they called him Dad for whatever reason. He was 18 years old. And I tracked down where he moved to, finally ended up in California. And the lady says, yeah, I remember him. He used to write stories about Abe Lincoln, meeting Abe Lincoln and shaking his hand. Well, the camp was right across the street from the lodge, so it had to be right there where he shook Abe Lincoln's hand. That's the same thing I could assume. And he was here on October 1st, 1862, Abe Lincoln, after the Antietam campaign.